Hello to all our tribesters and our extended tribe. This is Conscious Leaders, a series about leaders who are doing things differently and winning. Joining me today is Eleanor Mills. Els is one of the bigger names in UK media for the past few decades. She rose through the ranks of the Sunday Times to Editorial Director. And having run teams and strategies for one of the UK's leading papers, she's more than qualified to talk about leadership, the role of women, and highlight some really valuable insights on women in midlife. She is now the founder and editor-in-chief of Noon, an online media platform that empowers women in midlife. And it's really looking to change the narrative around the later stages of women's lives. Els, it's so great to have you with me. Thanks for joining.
Hi, really nice to be with you.
Let's start with your journey. So did you always want to be a journalist, and how did your career unfold?
Did I always want to be a journalist? I think so. My dad always used to accuse me of making remarks when I was younger, by which he meant that I would always kind of come out with the thing that everybody was thinking that no one quite said at kind of family lunch parties, to the point where he used to say to me before family lunches, "Don't make remarks." And I actually have made a career out of making remarks. I was a columnist, an interviewer, editorial director, editor of the magazine at the Sunday Times, and basically being a journalist is pointing out kind of what everybody's thinking and maybe nobody is saying. So yes, I think I was a born journalist. I think journalists are very nosy. They're interested in what's going on in other people's lives and in telling stories. And I was always interested in the stories that join people together and in reading the zeitgeist and seeing what was going to come next. So I think I probably couldn't have done anything else.
And looking back, what were some of the highlights?
Oh, I've done all sorts of things. I've interviewed everybody from Theresa May to David Cameron to Sheryl Sandberg to Charlton Heston to Gary Lineker over my career, Dalai Lama, all sorts of people. So it was incredible to get that kind of access. I've been to some incredible places, China, inside Facebook. Just the kind of access that you get is amazing as a journalist. And then I think also as an editor, there's that sense of being on the pulse, being in the room when decisions are made, being the person who is deciding what everybody else is going to read and therefore talk about for the next week. So there is a kind of very powerful kind of sense of hands-on levers, which I really loved.
And just looking back over you were obviously at Sunday Times for a really long time. Can you paint a picture of how it started off, how women started out in the newsroom then and how it is now? Has there been big changes?
I think in some ways there have been changes. In other ways, maybe not as many changes as you might hope. Except when I began, I was often the only woman in meetings, and people, I'd be in a meeting with 20 blokes and they would turn to me and go, what do women think? And that was quite a responsibility when you're like 25, 26. I think that there was a lot of very sexualized banter when I first began, and kind of, if you bent over to kind of pick something off the floor, they'd all be like, "Well, while you're down there, love," that was pretty common. And
accepted at that point, and at that point it was accepted, whereas now that sort of banter people can't necessarily get away with.
Back then, it was almost like a test to see if you were, a kind of shrinking violet or somebody who could handle themselves. I went to a boys' school for sixth form where there were 50 girls and about 800 boys, and then to Oxford, which again at that time was very male dominated. So I'd come up in a school where I was quite used to giving as good as I got when it came to blokish banter, and I think that definitely came in handy at the Sunday Times. But I think what was really exciting about that time was just this sense as a woman that you were being allowed in the room. It was still relatively rare for young women to be at the heart of decision making on a newspaper like the Sunday Times. And so there was something very, very heady in that. And I think that the fact that you were allowed in the room and that you were allowed to be part of it meant that you probably put up with behavior that you shouldn't have, because it felt kind of so exciting and so kind of groundbreaking almost to be there. I was running the news review section and some of the comment pages, and Focus, which was the big was doing the American election, or the Iraq War, or after 9/11, all the kind of outcomes of the terrorism. So to be running the coverage on such huge stories in my early 30s was very heady and exciting.
And you've obviously occupied senior roles for years. What have you learned about good leadership and being a good leader?
I think being a good leader is never asking someone to do something that you wouldn't do yourself or haven't done yourself. And really trying to take care of your people. I mean, I learned pretty early on that if you were nice to people and you went, they would always go the extra mile for them, for you. And so I used to promote people when they came back from maternity leave, because I knew, for instance, that it's really hard to come back when you leave your baby, and if you really feel like your job values you and is promoting you, then it's easier to kind of put that time in and feel committed to it. What other things? I just used to try to be nice to my people and to try and help them with the stories that they were doing. But I think I was also quite tough. I wanted good ideas. I wanted groundbreaking content. There was a lot of pressure to get scoops, to have stuff that other people didn't have, the story that everybody wanted to read that weekend. I was definitely pretty competitive. And I always wanted to win on that front, and that was definitely very much a part of the culture and of where I was, where I was. I think that my ideas around leadership and what leadership looks like has really changed in the 30 years that I've been doing it, and as I think it has in the world. I mean, certainly when newspapers also, like the last great empires, the editor really is the chief. It's a kind of real command and control economy. There's no flat hierarchies there. There's one person's view, and everybody else, when they say jump, you say, how high can I stop jumping yet? And so that was very much the kind of culture which we all grew up in. I'm glad to say I don't think it's quite that brutal now.
Yeah. And so how do you think that your leadership has evolved from the beginning to now?
These days, I mean, I run a team at Noon, and we're like a kind of bunch of mates, really. I think what I've really learned is you hire really good people and you let them get on with it. And if it's really bad, you say, oh no, not that mountain, but this mountain. But most of the time as a leader, you're saying, is it blue, is it yellow? And it doesn't really matter. So I think I've learned to kind of get out of people's way as a leader when it doesn't matter. And that really the point of leadership is to say when it's really going wrong and you need to go somewhere else, and to inspire people with a new vision. And I feel like what I do now is more thought leadership, is around a whole agenda around gendered ageism that I really care about. I mean, I really think as a society, we have to change the stories that we tell about the later parts of women's lives. And
so let's get into this now. So how did Noon come about, and what's its driving force?
So Noon is entirely a kind of founder, business and idea. So it really came out of my own experience. So I left the Sunday Times after 23 years, and I'd been there. It's very odd when you've been with a company for such a long time. So I think you become really institutionalized. And when I talk to people about it now, there's hardly anybody I know who has worked in a place for such a long time. But of course, when you have, and then you leave it, there's a huge sense of loss. It's a bit like a kind of weird kind of bereavement or something, and you lose that whole sense of identity. I've written about it as it feeling a bit like you're in Game of Thrones and you're one of those people with one of the really huge cloaks with all the gold on it, and they take the cloak off, and so you're suddenly like, well, wow, who am I without this huge cloak? But actually, it's actually really quite a good experience, because you realize when you take the cloak off that it was heavy, it was cumbersome, it endowed you with a whole thing which is not necessarily who you really are. And so for me, I felt a massive sense of kind of freedom. I now feel so much more myself, so much happier, so much healthier, so much less stressed, and also just much more in charge of my own destiny and able to explore the things that I really care about. So this moment when I came out of the Sunday Times was a huge thing, because suddenly I kind of looked around, and I was also interested. I was made redundant, and I've been quite open about that. And that was a real shock to the system, because I think if you've always been competitive and a winner and done really well, all of which I had, and the day that I was made redundant from the Sunday Times, it was my own interview with Sheryl Sandberg for International Women's Day on the cover of the magazine, which is a global exclusive about her engagement. So I wasn't being made redundant because I wasn't good at my job, and that was very, very hard for me to get my head around. And so I was quite open about talking about that kind of loss and that kind of expulsion from tribe and what that felt like. And that was also really the foundation for Noon, because I came out and I was Googling good old journalists. I was kind of going, oh, I need to find something to read about somebody who's been in this situation. What do you do when you've been super successful for 23 years and then you're suddenly out? How do I move into my next phase? Where's my next chapter? Where is something out there which are going to be like the pebbles in the wood for Hansel and Gretel, which will show me how to find my next path? And I couldn't find anything. So I've always believed in the Obama stuff about being the change you want to see in the world. So I set it up. I set up Noon, and that's all about empowering women in midlife to find a new chapter, to move on. And what I've discovered, the more I've dug into this, was that I was really onto something, that it wasn't just that there wasn't anything saying, what do you do if you've been made redundant? There was nothing really at all talking to women in midlife about our lives as they are now. We've had a bit of menopause stuff, but for me, this part of life is so much more than the menopause. I mean, the menopause is like kind of talking to a teenage girl and saying and defining her entirely by the fact that she had periods, rather than thinking of all the other things, exciting things that are going on in their lives. So I think while I welcome the more information and discussion about menopause, I'm really resistant to the idea of us being branded as walking hot flushes. That feels to me very reductive. And if you think that feminism has always been about women escaping their biology, to therefore suddenly brand a whole generation of women as menopausal as their main characteristic, I think is really wrong. So Noon is all about helping women through the pinch points that hit at midlife, and helping them into a new chapter.